Good evening, everyone. Just like to welcome you to ANU for today's event, which is COP29, what happened and where to from here. So really pleasing to see people here on a fairly hot sort of end of spring day. But just before we kick this off, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners. Darawa Nuna, Darawa Nanawal, Yangu, Nalamari, Dunamari, Nalawal Nari, Dawara Wari, Dindi, Wangira Lijinyen. So that's just saying this is Ngunnawal country. We're meeting today on Ngunnawal country, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also acknowledge other traditional owners who might be a part of this event. So today we've got a couple of things happening. So we've got the COP29 report back, and so it's got a panel of speakers who engaged significantly in COP, and some of whom have a long history of engaging in COP events. And then we've got a launch of an climate adaptation AI tool with Charlie O'Neill, who's in the audience here, who'll be launching that with me later on. So just clearly, I think everyone would be quite aware of COP, a challenging one in some respects, being held in another petrostate, a very strong focus on climate finance, but not only that, and some significant sort of challenges in the sort of politics and organisation of the event itself. And so there may well be some responses from our speakers about this. Obviously, it landed with a slightly contentious agreement towards the end in relation to finance, and that's a positive, but also critically assessed by developing countries as being inadequate. And so there's I think it's a COP where most people and most countries left not feeling that they got quite what they wanted out of it. So today's to sort of comment on this, we've got sort of a panel of 4 people. So we've got Salā, Dr. George Carter, who's the Senior Fellow and Deputy Head of the ANU Department of Pacific Affairs, and a member this time around of the Scientific Council of the COP29 Presidency, so heavily embedded in the process. We've also got Hina Aslam, who's the Andre Hoffman Research Fellow and at ANU, and also World Economic Forum supported person, and also engaged in many COPs in the past. Professor Howard Bamsey, many different hats and things we could talk about with Howard, but at the moment he's part of the School of Regulation and Governance here, Global Governance here at ANU. I was a former Australian Special Envoy on climate change, amongst many other things. And online we've got Tegan Clark, who's a PhD candidate at the Fenner School of Environment and Society, a youth activist, and engaged in Plan International Australia. So we've got people who have different perspectives, different levels of experience in COP, and hopefully that will make for an interesting and lively set of discussions here. So just wanting to start the process off, we've got each of the speakers will give just a short sort of coverage, like 4 or 5 minutes or thereabouts, about their impressions and particular messages they want to convey. Then we'll have a sort of a panel session with Q&A from me initially, and then from the audience, and then we'll bring that to a close and move into the adaptation AI launch at about 1:45. So our first one up is Hina. Please take the stage.
Thank you so much, Mark, for the kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. To everyone who's taken out time to be here, and also the ones online. It's a privilege to be part of this really important event in this platform, where I think I'm rightly placed to set a stage of what has been the key outcome or the key outcomes of this COP29, which was held in Baku this year. So particularly, I would like to reflect upon the progress, the outcomes that have been on critical themes. And as we heard from Mark, like this COP was all about money. all about finance and climate finance and mobilizing, and basically to upscale the 100 billion commitment of mobilizing finance from developed to developing countries, and upgrade that goal to what they have called it as new collective quantified goal. So there has been a progress in terms of advancing this climate finance this year, and consensus has been made to mobilize and to contribute 300 billion US dollars from developed to developing countries. And as we know, it has been not only a challenging summit, but it has come across a lot of criticism and a lot of perception about being hosted by a country which has been and is being dependent on the fossil fuels. So despite we take that there has been a notable progress, or perhaps a necessary first step in fulfilling commitments for the climate action and from the global stocktake, there has been a slow progress on phasing out fossil fuels, or particularly phase out coal. And that's what we are seeing ongoing from the Sharm el-Sheikh, and then Dubai, and then this year. So the huge gap in discussion around these fossil fuels phase out or coal phase out has been noticed and also been observed. And it's still shocking for me that there have been 30 COPs in place, more than 30, and yet we have not mentioned fossil fuels a couple of times this year. So that has been a downside of what I observed and I marked as one of the outcomes that I can see. Again, on the flip side, there has been notable progress on carbon markets in terms of after nearly a decade of work, the countries have agreed on finalizing the building blocks of how carbon markets should operate through standardized methodologies and guidelines, and how it should be based upon building transparent reporting frameworks from countries to countries and through improved methodologies and frameworks. There has been strengthened efforts on the adaptation side, although not particularly discussed in the new collective goal, but in the adaptation fund. So what we see from all that is we do see a step forward, but there still remains a significant gap in terms of the finance that was demanded from the developing countries and what has been committed. And I maybe come back to it later in the discussion part. So what we see as a key priorities for the next COPs, for the 30 and perhaps in 31, where maybe Australia and Pacific nations are looking forward to holding it, is again about finance and how do we see it being mobilized for the countries to update their nationally determined contributions to be able to meet the 1.5 degrees target, because the current NDCs that we see from countries are still far beyond what we are seeing from the Paris Agreement, and it currently stands at 2.8 degrees. So the discussions in Baku have made a progress, but still we need clear financing mechanisms. We need clearly the implementation plans, and also help the developing countries in reaching their goals through improving their NDCs, and more about what we are envisioning to advance in the climate finance, and also the key, which stands as a key to mark the climate action. That's all from my side, and I look forward to contributing more when we are at the panel for the discussion. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thanks very much, Hina, and for those reflections. And our next speaker is Salā, Dr. George Carter. And whilst George is moving down the front, just emphasizing how much standing George has within the community, both the Pacific community, but also within the COP community, and organizing it, reflecting his role in that COP presidency. Welcome, George.
Thank you very much, Mark, for and Natalie for organizing this great event, ICITS, and allowing us to sort of share some reflections on what happened at COP, and also an answer a question, and also acknowledging our panel, great panel that we have today. Tegan, if you can check your email, I just sent a last minute, yeah, can you see a slide there? Are you able to share screen? Okay. All right.
There's no slide attached. I'm sorry.
That's all right. I did have a slideshow. I'm sorry. I arrived on Monday night, straight into teaching in intensive. So I just finished class at 5, and I'm at 5:30, and that's the life that we have. And so I quickly put together a slideshow, just one of pictures, and then that's what they are. But we'll share them afterwards. And basically, I want to. I think our panelists will be sharing about the outcomes and what came out, but I'll share a little bit about what happened inside, and especially I wanted to show pictures, reflection of a group of students that we took with us. So a couple of us academics here have started a Climate Alumni program, and this is mainly for First Nations and Pacific students who are masters, PhDs, and honors as we're growing. And this opportunity is a part of exposure. While we're learning within our classrooms, climate negotiations and climate science, we wanted to take our students with us when we are engaged in the process. So I myself this year have multiple hats. As Mark alluded to, I've been selected as part of the COP Presidency, first time ever a scientific council. And our role is to promote the role of science in the research, but also in the negotiations, but also be able to speak as ambassadors about the COP process. A second role I have is I participate as a delegate from Samoa, and as part of that, I have been chosen to lead the Alliance of Small Island States in the area of indigenous and local communities in that agenda on the negotiations, and I also coordinate gender for AOSIS and Pacific countries. So as part their negotiations, and of course, third hat is an ANU academic, and to showcase the various different types of research and the work that we're conducting here in an ANU. And we take our students with us. This year, they've been embedded inside the Australian delegation, inside the Kiribati delegation, Tongan delegation, and the Samoan delegation. And they go in as active researchers for the organization, for the various countries, but also key regional organizations that are supporting in the negotiations. So that's the experience. And we've been doing this process for the last 3 years, taking our students, but also this is an ongoing research which I've had in climate diplomacy since the Paris Agreement. Okay, so Azerbaijan and what we saw this year. I would say one thing, the usual suspects in terms of those who stalled the negotiations really came out to play this year. You've read about Saudi Arabia and its role, but we must not also underestimate another player that really stalled the process this year was Russia. Russia and Saudi Arabia. They were two of the, they held on the key ticks around human rights. They held on the text around financing to try, and what people would think was the focus is on finance was rather in killing the Just Transition program. And that's what we saw. We couldn't get a final agreement on Just Transition and of course on the global stock take. So what we couldn't agree on this year to carry it on next year, that was sort of the real killer in terms of why what we did not achieve this year. And they held ransom and they used the finance corp as a way to, because we're there to, it is a very easy corp to discuss finance. It's about what we need to for implement. It's just setting a goal. However, you use that as a way to slow down the progress in the other key areas around the Just Transition program and the other areas around emissions, right? So that was generally sort of the back end in all of it, and trying to have them ease up on the language for finance and to give us that final target that we would have agreed on. Yes, developing countries did come out very loudly and say, this was not enough. Of course, it's never enough. A figure is never enough, right? But the real, disappointment was that we couldn't conclude on the program for just transition and GST, and that's going to carry it on next year, and it will make next year's COP in Brazil, which is about the NDCs, our new targets that we need to put forth from all countries, and will make that discussion even a bit more tense. Of course, we did not get the announcement that we wanted for this part of the world in terms of Australia and the Pacific COP. It was very, very, from what I hear, very tough discussions between the leadership with Turkey. However, Turkey did not relinquish it still wants to hold on to that sort of objective to hold COP. And so we have another year to let go, because it's only next year, in terms of next year's COP, that the next host will be announced. So it'll be a whole nother year again of waiting on Turkey to let go of that position to let Australia Pacific come this way. But it also makes the reason why we need to get it out of that part of the world. The negotiations are very staunch, and the role of the presidency is very much a coveted role. They have a very important role and can really direct where the negotiations going. So one of the big sights of behind the scenes is that there was a walkout from SIDS countries and LDC because they were not being properly heard by the presidency. There was not enough time, not enough space for the presidency, I think, to allow all parties to consult or amongst each other. I think there was, I don't know if it's a mistake or a purposeful tactic to not allow that engagement to happen. We saw this last year in UAE, at Dubai. They had sort of a big show that shows leaders discussing. This year, there was none of that. And so it became very frustrating, and we went over by 40 hours. And they had to come with the text and say, this is what we want. They had to force it. And very much that's what happened. The final text was a very forced text. In fact, while the COP was going on until the plenary, we were receiving the text because of AOSIS as the chair. We were receiving the text and say, could you agree onto this? We're going to be announcing in the next, few minutes. Is that, multiple times. So that was also a very uncomfortable position to be in when you have to agree as it's unrolling in front of you. Usually it's already agreed before you come on stage, but that's part of sort of how tense these negotiations were. And so why we also need a presidency that can give back the trust to the parties and engage in the process where you can consult, where you can be open. And I've said this in we did about 7 different side events, and two of the side events that we hosted with DQ and DFAT, and we said, we really need to bring in the values of trust back into the process, because right now we don't see it, and the parties are getting frustrated over and over. I think my time has run out, but some initial reflections in the process, but also I wanted to acknowledge our 7 scholars that came from ANU that came with us and supported our work. And if they're listening, thank you very much, and thank you.
Thanks very much, George, for those really useful insights, I think, in terms of the dynamics and the political positioning and how it felt to be one of those countries that was in the firing line in terms of being forced to make very, very quick decisions without adequate consultation. So it's always uncomfortable, but also fantastic with the alumni and the students, giving them the experience about what it really means to be a COP and letting them build their skills towards being the next generation of leaders. So fantastic story there. So the next person we've got is Tegan. So Tegan's online, and I'm talking about navigating COP as a young person. Over to you, Tegan.
Thank you so much. Yes, hi everybody, my name's Tegan. I'm a PhD candidate at Fenner, as was mentioned, and I'm down in Nipaluna, Hobart, which is why I'm joining online. I definitely don't wear as many hats as George or have as much experience as the rest of the panel, but I'm really excited to bring a youth perspective to this today. So this is my first time attending a COP, and to provide some context, I went with an organisation called Plan International Australia, and they specifically focus on fighting for gender equity and gender justice in a lot of different spaces, for example, conflict, but also climate change. So my contribution tonight is coming from that lens of gender, human rights, and child rights. Firstly, I'll start by acknowledging, or maybe with a bit of a reminder, that we started off, even before COP29 officially began, with the organising committee having no women appointed to it, which was heavily criticised globally. And I think this is really important to highlight, as this year the gender negotiations focused on the review of the 10-year Enhanced Lima work program on gender and what that was going to look like going forward. The presidency obviously took the steps to increase this gender representation after this huge criticism of it. But even at COP29, the figures that are currently coming around the percentage of women who were at COP is around 35% at the moment of participation from women, which was a very slight increase from last year's COP28 of 34%. Now, coming in as a young person and kind of living in this world as a young person, young people are quite disenfranchised or disillusioned or disengaged by these processes, both at the international level, such as COPs, and even on the ground in our own domestic political sphere. And rightly so that they are disengaged or disenfranchised by these processes. And I do agree with that and do feel that in some way, but I also recognize that all stakeholders must be represented in these spaces, and that some people want to challenge these systems from the outside and some people want to challenge them from the inside. And I think they should be challenged because the world is an ever-evolving space, and as we know, progress is often slow. The word ambitious is often thrown around, but things are never ambitious. So it's a difficult challenge to take on. I didn't really know what to expect from attending COP, besides that I'd been told numerous times that it would be chaotic in one way or another. And it definitely lived up to that expectation. It was a very difficult space to navigate socially. There's lots of people, there's lots of events happening, lots of side events, the delegation pavilion, etc. Frustrations with how the way negotiations were progressing and navigating the circus. That is the delegation pavilion. I've had it described to me in a few different ways on what the delegation pavilion is for those who haven't attended COP. One way is, it's a way of cultural buy-in. I don't necessarily agree with that. And another way is to show kind of what is happening within the climate space outside of negotiations, what is happening back home in different countries. What I will say, though, is that it has been a privilege to be able to access this conference and that there are a lot of people that deserve to be there and have their voices heard that simply aren't able to get there, whether that be for financial or other reasons. Now, as with most people, and for obvious reasons, I went in following the climate finance negotiations from the perspective, once again, of civil society and that gender, child rights, human rights lens. And in the lead up to COP29, what we were seeing is what you could say a lot of division or a lot of options around what that goal formulation would look like. And the negotiations came to a bit of a, from an observer's point of view, a bit of a standstill at the start of the second week, with the presidency working to streamline the text. And I was definitely feeling a bit antsy and nervous on the ground on how this goal was going to be delivered by the end of COP29. When the presidency released the next round of text, kind of midweek in that second week, we started to see a bit of a drawback in human rights language being included in the text, and also lack of concrete language around access and transparency for those communities and who was being considered as a vulnerable community, and how this finance would be reported against for these groups. And in the final text, we see an even larger drawback on this human rights, child rights language. And after a lot of advocating to the Australian Climate Finance Negotiator, which had the opportunity to do from being, a part of the delegation with not only Australia, but with the Plan International delegation, we really did push for greater ambition in the text around this, and happy to speak a bit more on this tonight in the Q&A section. But I'm going to leave it there because we have a bunch of experts on the panel, and I'm as keen as I'm sure all of you in the audience are to learn from them. But thank you so much for having me here tonight.
Thanks, Tegan. And our last speaker is Howard, and particularly I think Howard's going to talk about the highs and lows and perhaps about future COP organisation. Thanks, Mark. I'll probably begin by just picking up a few of the points that the colleagues have mentioned already, and maybe making a couple of additional comments on them. First, turning to the main outcome of the meeting, which was the new collective quantified goal, the new target. It's $300 billion by 2035. Sounds like a lot, but the current target of $100 billion annually was conceived in 2009 initially. So if $100 billion a year sounded like a stretch when it was conceived in 2009, then to be achieved by 2020, I think $300 billion conceived in 2024 to be arrived at by 2035 is not a stretch. I think it's business as usual. I think we'll overachieve. But who is we? Because if you look at the words in the decision, it's the last decision, by the way, that was in the Paris Agreement, where the $100 billion was confirmed, was itself pretty vague. It talked about this funding being mobilised with no real precision around what mobilisation meant. So the verb was a problem then. They solved the problem this time. There's no verb. If you look at the decision, it talks about how this funding of $300 billion somehow just appears. It's not mobilised. It's not specifically for developed countries to achieve. That the text says developed countries will take the lead. So it's even vaguer than the original decision. I think probably most developed countries left feeling not much more than relief that this typical UNFCCC fudge, if I can call it that, had solved a negotiating problem, but it hadn't done. I don't think it'll do. It won't achieve what developing countries went believing they needed and what they said they wanted. So there's still a gap. It's not a gap that's crippled the negotiation, because although a lot of developing countries, as George said, and as Hina said, were very unhappy with the result, it was seen as something to work on and work with. And I think the AOSIS statement at the conclusion of the meeting really made that clear. So it was that is the main outcome. I think takes us to the next steps. And as George said, so many of the other potential outcomes have just gone through to the keeper. They'll be taken up at the subsidiary bodies meeting in June next year. Do want to mention Article 6 again. This is the markets and non-markets achievement. 9 years in the making, but it fell into place at this meeting, and there's a bit of tidying up to do, I think, and some methodologies to be developed, and before we actually see trading taking place. But I think this is really relevant to the finance, and it's why I'm personally not too depressed about $300 billion. I think in a way it'll fade into the background, because I think there's a real chance that this new market arrangement will see much more investment in both mitigation and adaptation in developing countries. Yeah, there's a real chance of that. George talked about the difficulty of
the process and the way it was managed by the host country. I think it was an important point because there's been so much criticism of Azerbaijan hosting, given that it's so dependent on fossil fuels. And I understand the criticism. There's a group of important people who just a little while ago, these people include Christiana Figueres, former head of the UN CCC Secretariat, Ban Ki-moon, former Secretary General, and others, who've talked about the importance of devising a better system of delivering presidencies. I've read their work. I've also published something in the last few days about this. I don't think there's an easy way of fixing that problem of getting the president that everyone wants, because, as George made clear, some of the countries at the COP were very happy with the arrangement for the presidency. I personally saw no evidence that Azerbaijan was trying to undermine or stall, but they had relatively little experience in this sphere. They had not done any of the diplomatic preparation that all successful COPs have been preceded by. The most successful COP, I think most people would agree, was Paris, and the French diplomatic preparation for that was really breathtaking. It was amazing, and it was crucial in achieving the outcome. Azerbaijan doesn't have anything like the diplomatic reach of France, or might I say Australia, and there's, I think, a lesson there for whoever is going to be hosting COP31. It's time to get moving right now. So it's a shame that a decision hasn't yet been reached on whether Turkey or Australia, in collaboration with the Pacific countries, will host. As George said, the formal decision can't be made until the next COP, but the decision relating to COP31 that came out of this COP was pretty sharp. It pointed to the risks, the financial risks and other risks of delay, and it asked the subsidiary body on implementation to make a recommendation told WEOG, the group that has to make a decision about which of its members it wants to nominate, told that to get its act together, told WEOG to get its act together, and told the subsidiary body on implementation to make a decision, make a recommendation in June. So with luck, this issue will be resolved in June. I think George mentioned that we didn't get results on the global stocktake, what happens after that, and just transition. And a sort of symbol of how all of that area of discussion just stalled is there is no repeat or incremental movement on the formula in Dubai for transitioning away from fossil fuels. It's not mentioned, as Hina said earlier, it's just not mentioned in the outcome. And as George has made clear, there were very obvious reasons for that by countries that were dominating in the presidential considerations. And there are some even more alarming words that have been used about that. There's a lot to consider here for any country that's a prospective host for a COP. And as I said earlier, anyone who's hoping to host in the next few years ought to get moving very soon. Finally, just to reflect on Tegan's comments about young people, I think it's time we stopped globally to see young people as somehow observers in this process. They are the people with the greatest stake in the outcomes. I firmly believe, and I see no reason why, Australia and all countries cannot have youth in their official delegations negotiating. I think this is, some people will say too difficult to organise. I don't think that's true for a moment. And I think we ought to have now young people in the official delegation taking a part in negotiations. Yes, lots of them, as Tegan said, will want to stay outside, but some will want to be in and influencing the process. They ought to have a chance. Thanks, Mark.
Great. Thanks everyone for those reflections there, including Tegan online. And perhaps just to sort of keep that thread going, Howard, if you had a recipe for successful COPs, how to organise it and how to structure it, what would it look like in the future?
Mark, I think it's really difficult to be precise. I mentioned the paper that Barney Moon and others have done. I was persuaded to write something along these lines for the conversation, and I decided I wouldn't read the other paper before I'd written my bit, and it turns out that there's actually quite a lot of overlap. That is that, well, great minds, and the problem is that the complicated nature of the COP is compounding with every COP. One of the verities of the multilateral system is things never die. So we've still got sort of the Warsaw this and the Sharm el-Sheikh that and the Dubai something else, and all legacies from previous COPs that create agenda items that have to be dealt with. And there's so much overlap and complication that it would be hard for anybody to keep an eye on. And so I think if there was some way of streamlining the agenda with a big bang, that would be a great start, so that we were much clearer about what the important issues were. But I'm sure George would say that's impossible because, at this COP, we couldn't even sort out agreement on the issues we had on the agenda that everybody regarded as a priority one way or the other. So it's really hard to think of a way, I think, of fixing the COP. Lots of people say streamline it because there were 62,000 people accredited this time. And the pavilion area, Tegan was talking about the Australian pavilion, the whole pavilion area, about, I don't know how many, 150, 130, something like that. Everyone's got a pavilion. And then separately, everyone has their delegation offices. So in the pavilion area, you scarcely ever see negotiators. They're in a different world. And in the pavilion area, everyone is talking to everyone else at exactly the same time all the time. It's very messy. I don't know how you fix that. It's only 5 years since we started having this proliferation of pavilions, but I don't think it's really helped in terms of outcomes either in the negotiations, because now there's no mingling at all, effectively, or in the climate action sort of agenda, because it's side event after side event, one thing after another. So yeah, really difficult. I think we're stuck with the COP in pretty much its current form until we have a presidency that has real authority. And before you get to that point, back to George's point that we need to restore trust, there's now very limited trust in the process, and it's been declining for a long time. So I think we're in a difficult spot. I wish I could, give you 2 or 3 things that I think would fix it. I think there are several things we could do that might help. We could experiment, we could try, but again, we need authority, we need leadership, and that's what's missing more than anything else, I think, at the moment.
Thanks, Howard. I think that comment spreads much more broadly. We have got a bit of a vacuum of leadership in all sorts of different ways. So one of the challenges there, I guess, is to shrink COP down and streamline it. Actually reduces the opportunities for the voices that Hina and Tegan were talking about, or for the students that you led over there, George, to experience that. And so you've got some fairly basic sort of tensions there. Do any of you want to make a comment on this?
Thank you so much, Mark. So rightly so, we do see this proliferation of, these people, the kind of numbers that have been increasing through many years, people coming to the COP, raising their voices. That also marks another importance of how it is being really recognized in an urgency from not just the developed parts, but also considering some of the developing countries. Like if I give you an example, I originally come from Pakistan, and being in a climate space and environment space for a long time, I've seen the surge of people, civil society, government, private sector, having a chance and opportunity to raise their voices, to be able to even go to the COPs and be able to contribute, because being impacted by the most horrific natural disasters. It's kind of also realizing it, and also be able to make a contribution by making these efforts. But then there's again a question on the quality or the quantity as well, that whether they are given the right opportunity to be really part of the negotiations and be able to make a difference, or just follow the numbers and be able to speak on some events, and that's it. These are just a couple of my reflections in terms of how do we really find a right balance to be able to have the right voices, having research-based evidence presented to the decision makers, to the negotiators over there, of what could actually be the implementable solutions as a way forward. So that's my reflections.
Go ahead, Tim.
Thank you. I don't have too much to add in that. I agree. But yeah, I just wanted to go off Howard's point earlier around young negotiators. I think that is something that can be realized, and I think other countries are doing that. So we know it can happen, and it's about representing, all stakeholders within these processes. And I think that is a way of building trust, especially for young people or people who are disengaged in these processes. So that's all I have to add.
I think for my response, I'd like to frame it in a way how the EU can help themselves. I certainly agree with what everyone has said. It's a process that now requires no less than 50,000 people a year. Last year crossed 100,000, this year 66,000. But it shows the prominence and the importance of climate change, and everyone wants to be involved. And so I don't have a response of how to manage such talks. But in terms of process, it requires, as speakers have said, a presidency or a leadership that will try and manage, and that's inclusive, that's open to everyone. That's always the challenge, and that's one of it. But I think something that ANU can look into and bring in is, I think, while we need to use AI or the technology that we have to grasp the voice of the people, or grasp the ideas. I mean, what's been negotiated is what the national interest of countries. But we also have a citizen, a global voice. And that's what tries to come through the side events, that tries to come through all the other. And if there's a way that we can create, we now have the technology that can try and grasp what that public perception is. And I think that will be a great way to, as a barometer, to test what has been agreed and what people must say needs to be done. I think that's something that I would like to see. and rather nothing. I know it's something that stems to countries' perceptions, but I would like to see a global perception, and I think that's something that we could offer as ANU in terms of our researchers to give forth that global voice in the negotiations. That's just something I've been thinking quietly about it, and I hope to see. Yes, there's the presidency in terms of bringing in new processes that tries to manage all of this, but also another way is to bring that global voice. I think something that is important from the Pacific is the importance of science. Every year we see that erosion of science based, in the negotiations, and science is weaponized as a way by parties to, to stall the process, and that's something that we need to protect within the negotiations. That's sorry, I can go after.
Thanks, George. We might want to follow up on that last point later, but I just want to move into sort of Q&A so we can get some questions from the audience. That includes people online. So if you want to put in a sort of question, send it to the Q&A button down the bottom, and I'll pick them up on the screen down the front here. So perhaps kick it off with any questions in the audience here, in-person questions. Got one over there.
I want to begin by thanking everyone on the panel, the hosts, people who went to organize this event. I know it was been a very busy month for all of you, so I appreciate you letting us time that it is. Given all the conversation about as leisure, the UAE and the head of state hosting over the last 2 years, and the dichotomy versus the positive outcomes reached by Paris, I wanted to ask under the assumption that Australia does end up hosting the COP29 in conjunction with the Pacific Islands. There's a pretty reasonable argument to be made that we could fit into either one of those camps. We have a high reliance on fossil fuels and, seemingly middle political will to actually make the shift away from that. But we also do have the diplomatic range and capacity to potentially be more on the side of the positive outcomes. I want to ask, in your view, what needs to be done, what needs to change in those next 2 years to make sure it's all the more positive side of the economy?
Great question. Who wants to take that on?
It's all right. I'm tempted to make a few statements about results of elections, but I think I'll stay away from that. But clearly, we need a very strong, I don't know whether it's a change or not, but we need a strong government commitment to a successful COP. And we know that the first wish of all of the Pacific countries that will be involved would be that Australia would do something about reducing the impact of its exports of fossil fuels on the climate. And I think there are ways in which we could demonstrate that there's change underway that might result in that. And I won't go into the details here, but some of our colleagues at ANU have ideas on this. And I think I don't have any doubt personally that if Australia is hosting, there will be any absence of commitment to a powerful outcome on the response to the climate threat. I don't think that Australia will be hobbled in its presidency by its fossil fuel export. I don't think that will hold it back. I think it would not be credible were that to happen, and the absence of trust that George and others have been talking about would be so significant that the Australian national interest in hosting it would be vitiated entirely. So I just think any Australian government that's hosting a COP will be committed to a successful outcome. Whether we can organise ourselves, to do it, given the enormous preparatory load, is another question. I think it's already very, very late. I think my earlier comments make that clear. So frankly, I think we should be preparing now whether or not we're going to host. There are a lot of things we can be doing in Australia that would lead to a successful COP31, whether it's in Australia or in Turkey. And we should be getting on with it now, including initiatives offshore with other countries, with developing countries, with the countries of the Pacific. Some are underway. I don't want to suggest there's nothing happening at all. Some are underway, but we really need to increase, to accelerate do all the things that we would be doing if we already had the nomination secure.
Can I add?
Yeah, perhaps there's a question online which said was, where are we likely to find the leadership that's so badly needed, that sort of relates to some of those things that Howard was talking about, and perhaps you might include that in your answer.
Right, thank you. I think I'll just continue what Tom just said. We did work together. So as working in this space, and also given Australia in the fossil fuel industry and the export, we also see a lot of key developments happening in terms of the decarbonizing the industrial sector, let's say, the green metals, in terms of what we are envisioning in the future made in Australia policy, and many other safeguard mechanisms and many other policies and initiatives and incentives being rightly put. So I do feel that Australia is a thought leader in this space still, given that CBAM is coming at EU. And just like you said, not just the developing countries, Pacific Islands, so the countries are in a real need to build capacity around those. So Australia, given its thought leadership and also the knowledge base and also the capacity, I think it gives an opportunity for Australia to cooperate and have harness the potential to transfer those technologies, to help share those knowledge to help them well equipped with this right skills and right mechanisms to fight together as a globally climate action agenda. So that's where I see the potential opportunity, Australia having a strong leadership in this space, in the climate space, given its relevance to the trade-related climate policies, or given its ambition to become a superpower in renewable energy. So what we see as the lowest hanging fruit in climate and decarbonization is actually the power sector. And I think that's a leap that Australia can take and equip the other countries in this regard as well. So that was my 2 cents in this. Yeah. You want to ask?
Yeah. So one of the questions online was about Minister Bowen's comment about how we need a new industrial revolution, which relates to that. And there's people in the room who have been heavily supporting that agenda. Do you think that's enough, though, to actually take us forward?
Howard, do you want to start with that?
Look, I think the short answer, Mark, from my perspective is yes, it is enough, so long as it's delivered. So so long as it's obvious that it's being delivered. And if we can be confident that the sorts of aspirations that Hina was talking about, the programs that are underway, will have the full support of the Australian government. And I'm not suggesting they don't, but if we can be confident of that and remain confident, then I think we've got a good story to tell then.
I mean, I was particularly thinking about the trust issue that George raised, and whether this would be seen as just kicking the can down the road and another reason just to keep on doing what we're doing while we chase after these sort of new ways of doing things.
Can I just quickly respond on that? I think one of the problems one of the reasons that trust declines is that things happen secretly and the real agendas are hidden. I think Australia should be very clear, and the government should explain what the timeline is for eventually understanding that we're reducing our dependence on fossil fuel exports, that the rest of the world is not going to want them for much longer, and that we've integrated that fully. I think Chris Bowen has done that well from time to time, but I think it would do no harm for there to be, really concerted and repeated Australian description of how all this is going to come together.
Tegan, just making sure that if you do want to intervene, just put your hand up.
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in quickly. I guess I just wanted to add that whilst I don't know if Australia's leadership would deliver on COP31, I don't think I have an opinion on it. I think this question is on everybody's mind, knowing, our emissions are as they are still currently, and it, may come off as how can we judge these other petro-states for the past 2 years if we are to hold COP31. But I think I will say is that there will be a lot of pressure on the Australian government to deliver from the public on this, and also that we are situated within the Oceania region. So yes, it's being hosted by Australia, but we also have a responsibility to Pacific Island countries, our neighbours, as well. And, we are a part of, Australia is part of fueling the climate crisis, and they are at the front line of, receiving the impacts of the climate crisis. So I think there'll be a lot of pressure there if even, Australia not being, if Australia isn't awarded COP31, there still will be a lot of pressure on Australia in regards to that.
Thanks, Tegan. Another question from the audience who's got the mic. Over here. Okay.
Hello to all. I'm Kabir, studying climate change at CNU. Been following online. So what I saw was a lot of the universities have been engaging recently. So I was also talking about the area's role. So I was just wondering what broader universities' role beside knowledge contribution, what broader roles can universities play in this global negotiations and in broader COP outcomes? Take
them on.
Yes, I mean, there are various different global alliances around universities that come together. And yes, there's around knowledge production, but there's also around the research in COP. I think a broader area that we could come forth with, as I've said, is contribution from universities, the research into some of the big issues that are being discussed. The universities should have an active role in the agenda, not just in the solution side, which we are there. We're there promoting the types of research that we do, but I think it's there's a lot of think tanks and a lot of private corporations who really do go behind the countries and support countries and help facilitate countries. I see it in the Pacific, I see it in Africa, I see it in America. That they're behind supporting the issues that are being negotiated and bringing issues. I would really like to see my university be a part of that process. But of course, we are a national university. But it can find a way to support or research some of the agenda that is some of the issues that are being discussed. Sort of being active in that space. That would be something that we worth exploring. Of course, we hope to continue such programs. I know Fenner in the past used to have a class that went to COP, and we hope as it builds momentum, we could see more opportunities for universities to participate in that space if it comes to this part of the world.
Quickly, yeah. So adding on to what George has said, so there are like CSOs, civil society organizations or alliances or coalitions that give like that opportunity to be part of it and then be able to contribute in that space, which is one. But then again, given that academically we are a lot into research and we do have really interesting findings that we feel that must be worth presenting, but then there is also an opportunity gap that we see, like whether we are at the right place or we have this opportunity to be in some impactful or some meaningful working groups to be able to translate that research outcome into a real outcome. So I think in that regard, students or academics play a crucial role of how they could be well integrated into the system through different mechanisms and have their meaningful and their research-based evidence really marked into impactful actions. I mean, this drive is not just through self-motivation or an awareness. It also comes from an opportunity. That's where I see that there are many platforms and forums coming in, having an awareness of where those platforms are and how those networks could be leveraged. I think that's where being like the governance system, the departments or in the colleges maybe play a role, or even people like us could guide students to who to approach or where to navigate to. So
I just let on that's critical. So one of the questions online is in relation to industry engagement and their role within COP, and the sort of the suggestion is that that's not adequately taken into account in the discussions, and particularly sort of looking to engage more effectively with the sort of activist groups, so sort of more industry activist collaboration. You know, given what you've seen, is that a fair comment? Does something need to happen, or does this industry already have, you know, plenty of say in what goes on as it stands?
I can start commenting on. I do see real momentum in terms of how there are more collaborations and more, let's say, academically more research projects between academics, between government, and between the industry. And that's where I do see a real potential of these kind of partnerships, because initially what was normal there was a significant gap between academics and the private sector or industry doing their own things. But now we see a lot more collaborations, a lot more public-private partnerships coming in and bridging this gap. And where I like for myself, I work a lot with industry, not just from the academic perspective, but as an overall from the government. So these kind of partnerships, I think, provides a real opportunity and a real pathway towards making a difference. And that's where when they are also having a clear evidence of where they can contribute to and where they can also be benefited, I think that's where it can make a difference to them, given their business or economically viable feasibility, or given the opportunity that they are actually contributing to help the global climate crisis.
Yeah, I mean, of course, at the moment, in terms of the structure of COPs, you know, in the pavilions, we have the opportunity for private sector, both in the blue zone, the negotiation also agrees, so the open negotiations for business sector to industry to showcase. I think it also, I mean, but what next? Like, how can we really open it up for industry? How can industry really participate meaningfully, rather than just showcases as part of the expo in selling, you know, making money from profiting from the crisis. And we need to think, you know, other, you know, diplomatic ways in which they can also be a part of the process in terms of their pledges or in terms of their contributions. I think when we open up when we do have the international carbon market that we just completed, that will be an avenue for business to participate. But we also know that this is a state-party process.
Yeah.
It's the governments that have to be a part of it. So we need some sort of parallel or alternative process that allows businesses to come through. I mean, it's just the way we just have to expand our thinking. How do we get businesses domestically to contribute to the industry here? And then we need to sort of try and scale that at the international arena. But there is a space. I would say it's not fulfilling for the private sector, but it is worth exploring in terms of what can be that right recipe to have them really engage meaningfully, but also put in as much as the energy that governments are putting.
Just add one thing George pointed out and emphasised, that this is what we're talking about in negotiation. It's a multilateral intergovernmental process, and it's open to industry to engage in each of the countries concerned with their governments and their government representatives. And I don't think I think in Australia, for example, there's no lack of ability for industry to make their points of view understood in government.
Thanks. We just have time for one more question. So from the audience, if you can just be quick, please.
Yes, so I heard Boris Stewart today saying that there's been no progress despite all the COPs, and the emissions continue to rise, and there's not been enough progress. It's a complicated process, and it's really a matter for the G20. They contribute 80% of the problem. I know there should be something like carbon consumption tax in countries. I mean, I know these are issues, and I don't want to be offensive about it. But they were just talking about the urgency of what needs to be done, and that the complications of the COP process are not up to the job.
Thanks. Just for the online audience, the question was really proposition that the COP process is not delivered, and we need much more rapid action. And do we need other mechanisms such as a global carbon tax or something similar to really start to push back on emissions and emission growth? Anyone want to take that one?
Yeah, I will, because I've actually said something about it recently. I think in the absence of what in the text are called alternative sources of revenue, and that means something like, the T word applied globally to some activity, and logically enough it would be to the use of fossil fuels. In the absence of that, we're not going to see public finance reach anything like the level it's required. That is, I think most people would say, in the current geopolitical state of the world, impossible. The only time we've seen really rapid progress and acceleration in my memory is when China and the US, the two biggest emitters, the two biggest economies, the two most powerful countries in the world, the most influential, when they actively collaborated in the run-up to the Paris meeting. If we could just get those two countries together, the 18 others in the G20 would come along. But given recent decisions made in the United States, that seems fairly unlikely to me for the next 4 years.
Sounds like it's on ice at the moment. So I think we should wrap this up. Tegan, did you want to just say something?
I'll just add final words of, I think, like I said earlier, it's important to challenge these systems. I think we need to have, these international systems, all to work, because progress has to be made some way, and climate change is such a large problem. So while, it's important to criticize it, I do think it has played a role in advancing climate action.
Thanks, Tegan. So just to wrap this session up, we've got one last question from online, which is, would Howard Bamsey offer to chair COP31?
No,
Sure, Dave. There you go. Just like everyone to thank our panel members for your great input. And so this is more like the last kind of today's event, and that's just to launch the adaptation AI tool. And so as I mentioned before, we've developed at an ANU, there's sort of significant capability in relation to sort of an AI application. And so the logic of this is actually fairly straightforward, is that what we're tracking on now is hottest year on record, breaking by far the previous hottest year on record, which broke by far the previous hottest year on record. And so we're seeing accelerated temperature increase and the impacts that follow us from that. And it's not a good story. It's pretty much right across the globe, the costs are mounting human, environmental, and economic costs. The IPCC is very clear. In response to the mounting costs, we need to actually prove now action on adaptation, and we need to be not only starting to do that, but include in the conversation the benefits that can arise from effective adaptation. So appropriate and context appropriate adaptation. However, in Australia, for various reasons, we've pretty much dropped the ball on climate adaptation, and noting, of course, that there is a new national adaptation plan, which has been out for consultation and presumably will come around for be released next year. But notwithstanding that, is that coming back to that point that we have dropped the ball, we really do need to pick that ball up and run with it really quickly. It's in the national interest to do so. There's many things that are holding us back from doing that, in my view. Some of this is the lack of attention and focus on adaptation at political levels. If we look at the other side of the coin, the emission reduction side of the coin here in Australia, we've got huge amounts of political capital and institution building and finance sitting in ARENA, sitting in the CEFC, sitting in the Future Fund now, and many other institutions. We don't see a parallel set of focus on climate adaptation, yet arguably equally as important. Maybe that is because we haven't yet really figured out how to make money from adaptation. A lot of the focus on the emission reduction is simply because now people actually figured to make money out of that. So what I think we have to do is start to think about how we can actually accelerate adaptation, because if we look at the climate adaptation research within Australia, so it's not just that we haven't been paying attention to the institutions, we've actually dragged back on climate adaptation research. A colleague of mine, Juliet Meyer, a few years ago did an analysis that showed that adaptation research in Australia was 85% below trend because of essentially political decisions to pull out of adaptation research. Part of the reason too for why adaptation is lagging is that adaptation tends to be very contextual. What you do for one business will be different from another. What you do for one person in Brisbane is different from what people would do in Canberra, etc. So it's highly contextual in its nature. That's very different from, say, solar panels, where putting a solar panel on a house in Brisbane is pretty much exactly the same as putting on a solar panel on a house in Canberra. So you've got quite a difference in the sort of context there. Part of the problem, I think, too, is that there is no single source of reliable information for climate adaptation where people can go to and get reliable information to start their adaptation journey. What is this? How can I start the process of thinking about what's suited for me? And it's that latter point that I want to address today in this launch. So ANU, via the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, is launching today one of the very first climate adaptation AI tools globally. There's a few around which are much more aimed at the research community rather than broad application. And that draws particularly off the work of Charlie O'Neill and his colleagues, who worked with us pretty much on a shoestring. This is a shoestring budget sort of job, entirely funded out of ICEDs, out of our sort of monies, internal monies, where we've supported the cost of development and the cost of operation. So this will be free to use for anyone who wants to engage in climate adaptation. So to date, what this does is it draws information from several hundred scientific reports of different types, peer-reviewed and other reports, essentially reliable information, and it responds to specific queries from users about adaptation. So if you're a farmer in Western Queensland, you'd say, hey, I'm from Cunnamulla, this is what my property is, these are my interests, this is how risk averse I am, what are the adaptation options I could undertake? And it will give you an answer there in plain English. And it will give it different levels of complexity. So you can go for a simple answer or a more complex answer, depending on the user's interests. So of course, given that, it's fundamentally limited by the information that's inside this. So because this is a shoestring budget, we've got a very small proportion of the total amount of literature that we could include in there. And of course, as I said before, in Australia, we've dropped the ball on climate adaptation research, so some of that literature is now starting to age. So there are limitations here. And so there's many legitimate questions, of course, in relation to the broader application of AI. So faking of data, for example, or repetition and amplification of bias, or security and privacy concerns, or the potential increase in greenhouse gas emissions arising from its use because it's very computing intensive. So we've actually considered these in the design of this tool that Charlie's going to demonstrate in a few minutes. For example, the grunt processing for the adaptation, the AI, is actually done on the national computing infrastructure. So that's just been organised pretty much today to be run. But because of that, it means that that processing happens essentially without a carbon dioxide footprint, because running in ACT, it's effectively running renewables. So really important to emphasise that this is just the first step in helping Australians make their first step of their own on the climate adaptation journey. And we hope that you and everyone else online and elsewhere will find it useful. So to just demonstrate this climateadaptation.ai, we've got Charlie O'Neill, who's one of the powerhouses behind this. Charlie is an ANU Tuckwell Scholarship, part of the fantastic ANU Tuckwell Scholarship cohorts. The Tuckwell Scholars residence is essentially just across the road here, so it's called Scholars House. You can go and have a look at it and see where these brilliant minds sit down and have beer. And personally, Charlie's a delight to work with, and he's just got a Sir John Monash Scholarship to study his PhD in Oxford.
Thanks, Mark, for that very, very nice introduction. So yeah, essentially to keep this short, Mark and I about 9 months ago now met up and talked about some of the potential applications for this new language model technology, which we've all heard so much about. And I think probably the easiest way to show you about the limitations of this technology applied to things like climate adaptation and research and communicating to the general public is using the best chatbot available today. And I'm going to ask it a question, which is probably a bit tricky for it and a bit mean. But so this is Claude. Claude's widely considered to be a much better alternative than ChatGPT. And so you can see I've asked it about a very, very niche sort of temporal persistence of habitats question. And it cautions me that it can't really answer without much information. So this really highlights the limitation of language models that Mark and I and then ISID's collaboration with us set out to solve, which is these language models, one, don't have access to all the information we need to be able to communicate answers to very specific questions clearly to people. And two, they can actually make up stuff when they're unsure. This is what we call hallucination. It's when the language model spits out things to make it sound like it's producing a believable response, but without any verification, we don't know whether that's true or not. And so this tool that we developed, Climate Adapt AI, was aimed to counteract that. And so there's two main things that we did here. The first was we collaborated with ISEDS to collect their huge mass of internal documents. As Mark said, we only used a subset of this for the initial tool. But the key here is providing a language model with this context in the same way that humans might work. If someone asks you a very complex question, most of us don't know the answer off the top of our heads. We go and look it up. But with AI, we can do that really efficiently, and we can search over these documents in really clever ways. And so in using this context, we hope to be able to drive the hallucination that the AI produces to zero. And that's basically the key novel part of the algorithm we produced here, is when we're answering a question, we search over all the documents that ICES has, and we basically have a way to ensure that whatever's coming out of the language model at the end is contained in those documents. And if it's not verifiable, if it's not complete fact, it at least notes that, and that there may be conflicting opinions. And so you can imagine this is really useful for things like climate change research and adaptation research, where there's often contentious facts and opinions and even ways to interpret relatively well agreed upon statistics. And so, as Mark said, this tool is, you can think of it as a ChatGPT that's supplemented by an internal document store that you can trust the information that's coming out of it, and you can ask it in a way in which it's going to be clearest to you to explain it. And so if I ask that same question again here, there's a lot of like little buttons you can press here to make it faster or longer response. But what it's doing now is it's going off and searching. So it's searched all the sources that we have. And as you can see, it did that in 2.5 seconds. And it generates an answer for us, which is cited according to the documents that we had in the client store. And so our idea here is that people can read this answer. They can condition the prompt on who they are. As Mark said, the example of the farmer versus the example of an ANU academic, they're going to want very different types of explanations. And so we've actually set up a system prompt in which people can actually tell the language model in general how they want their responses to be conveyed to them. And then another key step, which we're sort of negotiating the IP and sort of things around this, is the citations. And so each fact that is brought up in this answer is linked to one of those documents in ICED's internal store. So you can go check that the information you've got is from a reliable source. We'd like to be able to like allow people to click on this and go view the source themselves, but unfortunately due to some IP things, that might not be the case. But that's the key idea of the tool. And if the answer is contained within a certain document, we're fairly reliable that we can pull out that answer for you. So I don't know, does anyone have a question that they want to ask? Yeah.
It's really exciting. So thank you for sharing.
Oh, sorry, I meant a question I can type in. Did you want to?
Oh, it's who's going to curate the articles that are in the climate store source?
Yeah. So a really key thing that we wanted to do, and ICEDS has been incredibly generous in like getting this off the ground and providing the initial funding, but we do want this to run in perpetuity. And as Mark noted, the value of a tool like this is directly derived from the value of the document store you're using. And so what we've set up is a way for, even when I move on and overseas, for people to be able to upload their own documents and for the ICEDS team to hopefully do so in an automated way. Without getting too much into the technical details, the way the neural search works is it takes documents and turns the words into very, very high mathematical like numbers representation of those things. And we've automated that whole process. So in the future, anyone trusted to upload documents should be able to do that with one click of a button and just upload whole folders. And we're thinking about ways in which we can integrate like standardized reports that come out annually and how we can sort of automate that pipeline of reports into the store.
Thanks to the presentation. If I go home and feed in those questions into Copilot or Gemini, will I get substantially different answers? And what I'm asking is, how do you tailor it? What's a tailoring process to produce this?
Yeah, so I guess the probably like simple delineation between the things we do differently and the things that something like ChatGPT or Gemini might do is that one, we have the context. So the document store is the most important part. So ChatGPT can't access these files and papers often behind paywalls, and it's often not trained on them in the first place. So that additional context is the first thing that gives us a different answer and hopefully a much more specific answer. And again, an answer without hallucination in it. The second thing in terms of tailoring is that we've done a lot of what's called prompt compiling. And so behind the scenes, this language model, after it gets all these documents that are context to the question that the user's asked, we've optimized that prompt to convey that information in the best way for someone interested in climate adaptation research. And an additional step on top of that is you can do your own prompt sort of engineering or suggestions yourself, right? So that's where the system prompting comes in. So you might be able to just have a persistent prompt in there, which tells the language model here that you are a farmer from rural Queensland and you run cattle and you have all these specific things and you want to understand information in this very clear, simple way. Or vice versa, you might be an ANU academic very interested in biodiversity And so you can prompt it in that way. And in that sense, in combination with the context it's getting for these questions, you get a much more tailored, personalized answer than something you'd get from one of those standard language model tools, which are built for generality and brilliant for that. But we wanted to leverage that language technology for this specific instance, which allows us to do a lot of optimizations around climate adaptation.
So I think what Charlie particularly wants is someone to offer up a question. So,
a question I know a colleague would love me to ask is, what adaptation actions could a high school in Wagga take over the next 5 years?
Right. I don't know if there's going to be anything in the document store about high schools in Wagga. We'll see.
I'm thinking it's not sure how it can be about.
I think that actually highlights a pretty important thing, which is that obviously since we've tried to drive hallucinations to zero, an inherent constraint in that is that we want the language model to only use information in the corpus. But that's not very helpful if the user doesn't know if that information is presented in the corpus or not. So another key thing which we might think about doing is providing easy summaries so people can sort of ascertain what sort of information is in there, because at the moment it's a bit hodgepodge with what's contained. So here, so it's sort of given relatively relevant stuff. I mean, not very specific to a high school in Wagga, but again, the citations are there, and it looks like those are fairly relevant to the question asked. Yeah.
At the 2.9.
I don't know what we could do with 10 seconds.
So, thanks, Charlie. And there was one on the sort of hand up with a similar question or example.
Yeah, actually here, I guess relevant to some of the industry, you asked, can you tell me where would be the best place to grow Riesling grapes in 2050?
Yes.
This is a bit mean. Comes down to money.
Yeah.
So yeah, it goes with that one. While that's going, another thing that I probably should emphasize is Mark talked about, obviously these language models have a large climate footprint. Does Tasmania sound correct? What was I saying? Yeah. Another thing that Mark mentioned was the carbon footprint of language models, and that's something that we're pretty conscious of, because it's quite ironic to have a tool aimed at helping educate and research on things like climate change and adaptation if that tool itself is contributing significantly to emissions. So Mark talked about the NCI, and we're very grateful to them for being able to host it for the next few years, hopefully. But another thing that we've also pretty happy with is this nifty thing we've come up with called prompt caching. So when you pass a prompt into a language model, it spends a lot of energy reading over what you've put in before it starts outputting its answer. And so as I talked about before, we have this big prompt compiled behind the scenes, which tailors the language model to specific adaptation communication. But that obviously incurs a huge energy cost. And so what prompt caching does is we basically save the state of the language model for everyone and every time you use it. And we only have to tweak that slightly, which means we're actually able to cut down on the energy that the language model is using by about 90 to 95% for most questions. And so that's become a really core part and something that's actually catching on in the wider LM community, the strategy, which we're really happy to have come up with. But yeah, any other questions before we finish?
I'll get to wrap it up.
Yeah.
I'm just 7. But I'm sure Charlie would be happy to answer any other questions you might have subsequent to the event closing. But thanks again to Charlie. It was great. So just a really quick wrap up. We've heard a lot of really interesting reflections on COP and what this whole process might look like in the future. We've just had a demonstration of a tool that may make Australia more adaptive. Part of our remit as a national university is to deliver national value, and I think that's exactly what that tool is capable of doing. And there's many, many different uses or potential uses for this, apart from people who want to grow Riesling grapes or something like that. I'm not giving you a hard
but even within policy areas, and so I've had discussions with DQ, and they say that'd be great for us to be able to scope out some of the things that they're interested in. So I think there's many applications for this. And I just want to wrap up by saying thanks to everyone, both online and also in person here, for coming along to this event. We'll send out a sort of a survey for how you experience the event. We really love it when you fill out that survey because it gives us information on how we can do things better. So that's really appreciated if you could spend a few minutes on that. But I also really want to say a huge thanks to Jerry, who is here tonight. So Jerry's our sole comms person at the moment, but also thanking Christian and Renee, who have previously contributed to this event, and all the ISETS team who are here tonight. But particularly just want to say thanks to our panelists tonight, George, Hina, Howard, and Tegan and Ryan. So thanks again. Have a great evening. Cheers.